So you can make the argument that Nixon wins the Cold War, not by flying to Berlin and saying, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, but by kicking back shots with Mr. Eyebrows here, the beloved General Secretary of the Soviet Union from the mid-60s to the early 80s, I think, Leonid Brezhnev. I mean, just look at those eyebrows. They're a national and international treasure. Hopefully, one day you too can eyebrow as well as Leonid Brezhnev. But because the Soviet Union is going through economic problems of its own, with deteriorating, with basically a problem in the agricultural sector, and because of the fact that the Soviet Union has kind of bitten off more than it can chew, interestingly, there's this period of détente in the Cold War where you see a sort of a de-escalation in hostilities with the Soviet Union. And it kind of mirrors, coincidentally enough, a détente that occurred in the Eisenhower administration, which, remember, saw Richard Nixon serve as vice president. But it's around this period of time, and this both includes the Nixon administration and beyond it, that we see the strategic arms limitation talks, or SALT I talks. This is an agreement where both the United States and the Soviet Union agreed to freeze the number of intercontinental ballistic missiles at current levels. Now, that being said, the U.S. and the Soviet Union still possess large enough nuclear arsenals to basically blow up the world many times over, but at the very least, we can console ourselves with the fact that at least we can't blow up the world like 11 times over, just a paltry 10. But still, it's one of those points that it symbolizes a decline in hostilities. And remember that for a conflict that is very symbolic, like the Cold War, that's important in and of itself. The progress made within Nixon's administration leads to the Soviet Union signing the Helsinki Accords, which again is one of those big symbolic moments. It doesn't mean that the Cold War is definitively over. The Cold War still goes on. The USSR is playing at a disadvantage, but the Cold War does go on. But what we do see signs of is the fact that with the Helsinki Accord, we see the Soviet Union commit to post-World War II borders, a right to self-determination, human rights, free and fair elections. Whether or not they actually honor these pledges is a different question. What it does sort of symbolize, though, is the fact that the Soviet Union is, in a lot of respects, trying to normalize its relations with the U.S. and the rest of, the rest of NATO, and even countries beyond NATO. Not to be too overly simplistic, but if you think of international relations as wrestling, which I'm not sure is which I don't think is actually a terrible idea. The Soviet Union has long played the heel in international relations. This country that has kind of thrown its weight around and has, kind of tried to, intimidate, countries, especially in Western Europe. This is kind of a sign that maybe it's not so much embracing the villainous Macho Man Randy Savage role or the Undertaker role. Maybe it's becoming or trying to move towards the role of being a hero, like, Dwayne Johnson, aka The Rock. Who knows, but it's at least the sign that the Soviet Union's attitude towards the rest of the world, specifically Europe and the United States, is beginning to change. If Nixon gets high marks anywhere, it tends to be in the realm of foreign policy. Even if you're not a fan of Richard Nixon and his foreign policy, and by the way, that was certainly a very common opinion, see ergo the protest at Kent State, the fact is that you had to give him this, at least, that he was fairly creative and open-minded in foreign policy, despite the fact that you would expect him not to be that way. Again, he's an arch anti-communist, and what does he do? Well, he actually paves the way for the United States, in many respects, allying with communist China during this time period. But in the realm of economics is where we see some difficulties. And some of these problems are problems that kind of predate the Nixon administration. Some of these problems occur because of foreign policy-based developments. So in the 1970s, what we begin to see is a decline in U.S. industrial productivity. That in itself is surprising. This is the first time that we've really used those words in conjunction with one another. Industry, decline, and the United States. Like, the narrative has been since the early 18 teens that the United States is, growing in terms of its industrial capacity. But for various reasons, we start to see that decline. Part of it is because industries in northern states, they begin to search for better business environments and climates. They first look at states in the Sun Belt, but many of them actually go overseas to find cheaper sources of labor. This is kind of the double-edged sword, to a certain extent, of the increasingly high standards of living in the United States during the 1950s and 1960s, is that it's kind of hard to pay middle-class wages to blue-collar workers on a sustainable level. But that's kind of a debate for economists. But what we can also say is that there's a few other developments here that also kind of contribute to this coming storm. So first, Nixon alters the monetary system that was put in place by the United States immediately after World War II. After World War II, basically the dollar becomes the currency of, becomes the world's reserve currency, and the dollar is in itself backed by gold. Starting in 1971, though, Nixon basically changes that policy where the dollar is now backed by faith rather than gold. This change not only impacts the U.S. economy, but also economies around the world. It's also known as the Nixon shock, by the way. So you have that. You have this slow but steady process that we call deindustrialization that really kicks off in the 1970s. And then you also have an event that's called the Yom Kippur War. The Yom Kippur War was an attempt by a coalition of Arabic states led by Egypt to basically take revenge against the newly formed state of Israel for Israel's military success in an earlier war called the Six-Day War. Basically, a coalition of mostly Arabic states are poised to attack Israel in 1967, and Israel gets the jump on them. They preemptively attack, and not only does this planned attack against Israel not work. Actually, Israel ends up occupying Egyptian, Syrian, and Jordanian territory. The Yom Kippur War is a war that would theoretically allow these mostly Arabic states to take revenge. And armies like the Egyptian army were equipped with the latest Soviet weaponry. And so the idea is that this is kind of the best opportunity to attack Israel. And remember that the U.S. is a primary supporter of Israel during this time and, today as well. Now, what happens is that the Egyptians launch a surprise attack, and Israel is kind of caught flat-footed. And it actually looks like Israel might get wiped off the face of the map. Things look very, very dire for the Israeli army. But then what happens is that due to a phone call between Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, the United States authorizes military aid for Israel, including some of the latest anti-tank missiles that just gut the Egyptian and Syrian armies' tank-based forces. And so what happens is that while Israel takes a beating in the Yom Kippur War, it still stands, and it actually wins the war. That's still kind of a controversial point, but it comes out ahead. And so that was kind of the last best shot for countries in the region to roll back the existence of Israel. And so what happens instead is that many of these countries basically voice their displeasure not by arms, but by the use of their wallets, or more specifically, resources. As you guys probably know, the Middle East today is associated with the production of oil, energy in general, and so many of the oil exporting countries, which were organized into a cartel known as OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Producing Countries, they decide to basically embargo the United States. They will essentially only produce a certain amount of oil that will be exported to the United States. And the thing is as we'll talk about, oil isn't everything. Basically, any good or service that you buy has to be transported. That is, the cost of that transportation is built into the price of the item. And so once you begin sort of cutting energy or increasing energy prices, that increases the cost of everything else. And so what we're seeing is this storm that's developing in the Nixon administration called stagflation. This is where you have basically an economic recession. Economic growth is shrinking, it's stagnating, but at the same time, the amount of money in the money supply is increasing. Both of those things in isolation are bad enough. But what's happening is that economic growth is slowing. At the same time, the cost of goods is also increasing. And that's very, very dangerous. So we'll come back to this because it really takes a few years for the full extent of that crisis to be realized. You kind of see this here to a certain extent. But inflation is going to be, the primary economic worry of the 1970s. So the other explanation for this increase in inflation involves the massive amount of government spending related to both the Great Society and the Vietnam War. And for better or for worse, the Vietnam War is about to end. And the person who helps to end it is Daniel Ellsberg. Daniel Ellsberg is a Defense Department employee, and while working in the Pentagon, he comes across information that really traumatizes him, including the grisly details about the My Lai massacre, which, remember, involved U.S. forces massacring men, women, and children in the village of My Lai. So Daniel Ellsberg believes that somebody needs to know about this because he's aware of the things that are being broadcast on the news and also the information that he's seeing, and he knows that there's a big contrast between those two things. And he believes that the American people need to know about it. So the question is, how do you get that information out? Because it's one thing to say those things, but nobody has any evidence. The only people who have evidence of things like the My Lai massacre is the Pentagon. And the problem is that he can't actually, he can't actually smuggle that information out because all of those documents have to stay in the Pentagon. And this is where the impact of technology comes in, because it's around this time period that the Xerox machine starts to sort of appear in institutions and facilities like the Pentagon. It wasn't common, but it was starting to make an appearance. And so Ellsberg basically gets access to a lot of these classified documents. He makes Xerox copies, and then he passes them on as a whistleblower to the New York Times, and they republish them. And so we're talking about, the discovery that the government is not being altogether honest with the American people in the Vietnam War. And this is something that people are getting a sense of before the Pentagon Papers. Just imagine what life is like after the Pentagon Papers. So the Pentagon Papers reveal that the Johnson administration systematically lied to the American people about the Vietnam War. It reveals America's involvement in the overthrow of President Diem. It reveals the fact that the Gulf of Tonkin incident did not happen at all like Johnson described, and the fact that Johnson not only misled the American people, but he misled Congress. And also you have the details about the My Lai massacre. It also reveals that a lot of the Vietnam War was just as much about containing China. And at this point, as relations between China and the United States begin normalizing, I mean, what's kind of the point of fighting the war in Vietnam then? Um, so, um, what happens is that really the Pentagon Papers only run through the year 1967 or 69. It doesn't really involve anything that happens in the Nixon administration. But Nixon's the guy in charge. He is kind of the official person who's responsible for the Vietnam War now, and so he gets the brunt of the pushback. And again, Nixon is already pretty paranoid, and now he sees that the New York Times is republishing, the Pentagon Papers or excerpts from the Pentagon Papers, and so Nixon becomes the person who is blamed for a lot of these developments that actually occur before his presidency. So it's at this point that Nixon becomes even more paranoid. So Nixon has a leak problem. He has a leak problem outside of the White House, as Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers have kind of proven, but also he has a leak problem within the White House. His Secretary of State, the brilliant yet duplicitous Henry Kissinger, would regularly leak and repeat things that were said in the Oval Office to members of the press and also other academics and think tanks, that kind of thing. And so Nixon became very, very worried about who he talked to and the things that he said to other people. So Nixon actually gets some advice from an old friend, his predecessor, President Lyndon Baines Johnson. And Johnson, who, had his own sort of paranoid streaks, I suppose, took it upon himself to actually install a state-of-the-art recording system throughout the White House. And, kind of Johnson partially did that so he could acquire leverage and blackmail over his opponents and even some of his supporters. But for Nixon, it's more about making sure that he's protected in the event of a leak. So Johnson's like, yeah, go ahead and, install a state-of-the-art recording system like I did. You can't go wrong there. Well, yeah, Nixon goes wrong there because basically what happens, and for a historian, this is fascinating. Basically, the tape system that's installed in the White House, actually throughout the White House, is a tape system that activates whenever it detects basically the human voice. I can't really explain how that works technologically, but I can tell you that the technology works very, very well. So we actually have a fantastic audio track record of most everything that happens in the White House during this time period, including President Nixon and his aides and cabinet officials very often in their more unguarded moments. That becomes important in just a little bit. But Nixon is somebody who also is worried about the upcoming presidential election in 1972. He's very sensitive to the criticism that he's getting, especially this pushback by the counterculture. And so in response to the leak of the Pentagon Papers, the Nixon campaign establishes something called the Committee to Re-elect the President. I'm cringing. Come on, Mr. Dry, get through it. Or creep.
Well, I'm not a crook.
Yeah, sure. So CREEP is the organization that is charged with investigating leaks. And the individuals who were hired by the campaign to investigate the leaks were 5 individuals called the Plumbers. This is what passed for wit, I guess, in the Nixon campaign. How do you fix a leak? Well, you hire plumbers, except you probably don't hire plumbers to break into other people's houses or businesses. These plumbers did. In fact, one of the things that they tried to do is they tried to actually establish some leverage over Daniel Ellsberg. They actually broke into the office of Daniel Ellsberg's therapist. And debatably, one of the reasons that Ellsberg was probably in therapy in the first place was because he saw some pretty disturbing crap while working at the Pentagon during the Vietnam War. So, that being said, there is a certain degree of what we call plausible deniability given to creep. Nixon gives the go-ahead to establish creep, but more or less the people who are running creep and aware of his activities are people sort of below Nixon's level. So at this point, Nixon is kind of guilty for setting the ball rolling and maybe not paying careful attention, but Nixon is not monitoring the day-to-day affairs. In fact, the idea is that Nixon had as little knowledge about creep and its activities as possible, because if you're looking at the world beyond Washington, things are sort of taking some dramatic turns in Southeast Asia. So because of détente with the Soviet Union and because of the fact that the U.S. has kind of cozied up in its relationship with China, it looks like Vietnam is kind of diplomatically isolated. The Soviet Union has no real interest in escalating hostilities with the West. And at the same time, what we're going to find out is that China and Vietnam also have their own history of disagreements. And so this puts the pressure on Vietnam. Nixon and Kissinger see their opening to force North and South Vietnam to come to the peace table. So, by late 1972, Nixon actually tells us what an honorable conclusion to the Vietnam War actually means. And his vision involves both the North and the South being hauled into a conference room and being forced to broker some kind of long-term, or heck, I mean, at this point, even short-term conclusion. Because at this point, since communism appears to be contained diplomatically, suddenly there's not that sense that Vietnam is like the most important thing in the world for the United States. Nixon is just trying to figure out a way to get out of it rather than a way to decisively win it. But the North Vietnamese basically stonewall negotiations into December of 1972, and that's when, around Christmas in 1972, Nixon authorizes what is called Operation Linebacker II. Basically, this is an operation that's almost a throwback to World War II, where you send mass bomber fleets over strategic targets over cities like Hanoi, the capital of North Vietnam, and you bomb them. Now, to be honest, these bombing campaigns were targeted, but they target, well, using big bombers like B-52s, where you're just dropping tons and tons of explosions. It's kind of like aiming with a shotgun, okay? Even if you're aiming with a shotgun, it still goes everywhere. And that's kind of what happens in these bombing campaigns. And there's a lot of criticism, not just from China and the Soviet Union, but also from U.S. allies. And actually, from, let's say, domestic audiences in the United States, including the counterculture. That being said, after about a week of these, really a week or 2 weeks of these bombings, suddenly North Vietnam announces that it is willing to come back to the negotiating table. And it stipulates that it, under no circumstances, is coming back because of these bombing campaigns, which lets you know it's actually because of the bombing, for better or for worse. So this sets the stage for yet another agreement, peace agreement in Paris. But instead of it being the Treaty of Paris, it's called the Paris Peace Accords. So this is a ceasefire. It's not really a long-term resolution to the conflict. But then again, that's kind of how the Korean War ends. And for the most part, that's the best you can hope for almost in any Cold War conflict, at least when you're trying to kind of thwart a communist insurgency. That's the best you can do short of escalating the conflict. And by 1972, we also have to admit that the Viet Cong had kind of petered out a little bit because of this policy of Vietnamization. And so it looks like by 1972 that from the American perspective, the Vietnam War has kind of been won. Again, you can kind of argue that either way, but the thing is that North Vietnam acknowledges the legitimacy of South Vietnam, which it had not done in the earlier Geneva Accords in 1954. So with this, at the very least, North and South Vietnam kind of acknowledge one another, and there's also a private assurance that the U.S. gives South Vietnam. And this is not something that's in the Accords exactly, but this is assurance that I think it's Henry Kissinger gives South Vietnam's president, President Thu. And the assurance is this, that if North Vietnam ever tries to do what it did during the Tet Offensive, where it tries to basically make a sweep through the South, the United States will come back and it will bomb the heck out of North Vietnam again. Because in Operation Linebacker 2, it's revealed that this is kind of a source of vulnerability for the North Vietnamese, and that without strong international support from the Soviet Union or China, it's kind of vulnerable. So again, do we see like one of those decisive military victories that we see at the end of World War II? Well, no, but you're not going to see that in the Cold War. Conflicts tend to freeze or peter out, and to a certain extent, any conflict that doesn't end with, a major change in the status quo isn't a terrible result. So, with the Vietnam War out of the way, let's return our attention to Nixon and Creep.
Security, Frank Wells.
Yeah, sir. You might want to send a maintenance man over to that office across the way. The lights are off and they must be looking for a fuse box or something, because them flashlights, they're keeping me awake. Thank you. Good night.
Therefore,
So it's about this time, after the Paris Accords were signed, that the Committee to Re-elect the President, or CREEP, decides that it's not content any longer to investigate mere leaks. Instead, what it decides to do is it actually kind of creates them. But instead of creating leaks for the Republican Party, it wants to leak information out of the Democratic Party. Except that the way in which the Plumbers are going to try to get that information is to, kind of burglarize the Democratic Party's headquarters located at the Watergate office complex. So that's what happens. And again, it's not that much of a stretch considering that they burglarized the therapist of Daniel Ellsberg. But the thing is that when you aim for those types of targets, don't be surprised if you get caught, which is, of course, exactly what happens. These 5 members of the Plumbers are caught and arrested. Now, when word gets out, Nixon, believe it or not, is shocked. Partially because it looks like CREEP has basically been allowed to kind of do its own thing. Again, there's that system of plausible deniability in place. Nixon is, I think, is responsible for creating that paranoid atmosphere, and maybe with a wink and a nod suggesting that whatever has to be done to eliminate leaks can be done. But Nixon didn't mastermind the break-in at the Watergate Hotel, and Nixon's first reaction was, who was the blank who ordered it? Partially because breaking into the Watergate Hotel to search for secrets that could undermine the Democratic Party was a colossally stupid idea. And you'll see just how colossally stupid it is in just a second. But what gets Nixon in trouble here is not the fact that the break-in happened. People do illegal stuff for politicians all the time, with politicians and being the beneficiaries. But politicians are only responsible if they take steps to cooperate or conspire with groups like the Plumbers. So what Nixon does, which is gets him into trouble here, isn't really related to the break-in at the Watergate complex. It's the fact that, one, he bails members of the Plumbers out of jail, tries to suppress what happened, and he pays members of the Plumbers a considerable amount of hush money, basically large lump sums of cash so they stay quiet. So that's what gets Nixon in trouble. Now, the thing is, though, again, this is in some respects the most colossally stupid scandal in American political history, because what Creep is doing is that, again, it's trying to allow Nixon to obtain some kind of political advantage for the upcoming election of 1972. So how does this break-in that occurs in June of 1972 impact the election scheduled for November of 1972? This much. So George McGovern picks up Massachusetts and D.C. Wow, a truly heart-stopping presidential election. Fascinating. No, just no. Thanks. I needed that. So Creep is trying to find the Democratic Party's dirty laundry so they can use it in the election of 1972. Even though Satan would have a better chance of winning the presidential election of 1972 than any member of the Democratic Party. Why in the world do you need presidential or political secrets? There's no point. But that is kind of the tragedy and the absurdity of Watergate. So members of Nixon's campaign are fishing for secrets that they don't actually need for Nixon to get reelected, which is probably why Nixon thought it was stupid in the first place. But where Nixon gets in trouble, again, is not the break-in, but the fact that he helped cover it up. So it's at this point that Nixon's paranoia deepens even more. He has hall phones and rooms in the White House wiretapped, and we kind of talked about that a little bit earlier. But it's also the point where the Senate begins to investigate the break-in and the cover-up. Now, we also need to be very clear about the composition of the Senate. This had just happened. Okay? One of the largest Republican sweeps in American political history. And by the way, Nixon kind of wins this election by running against the counterculture. Basically, he kind of depicts the Democratic Party, led by progressive George McGovern, as being the party of the counterculture, and Nixon wins. I mean, without really breaking a sweat. Again, one of the surprising revelations about Nixon is that if you look at the counterculture, which obviously has a very loud voice, Nixon is very unpopular. But again, it's not fair to say that he was universally unpopular. The guy had just kind of de-escalated the Vietnam War, and also Nixon seemed to wasn't afraid to stand up to the counterculture and the hippie movement more broadly. But what this means is that the Senate, the body that is investigating the break-in at Watergate, is chiefly composed of Republicans. And if, so long as Republicans don't find anything too damaging, they're probably going to give Nixon a pass. At the very least, it's probably not going to directly touch Richard Nixon. And this is also where Nixon says, bet you didn't see that coming. And Nixon also authorizes his Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, to appoint a special investigator, a special prosecutor by the name of Archibald Cox to investigate the break-in. So here is Nixon's fatal flaw, and this is not a flaw that is unique to Nixon. You appoint an independent investigator or attorney or prosecutor, and then you actually don't think that they're going to be independent, which is kind of what happens with Nixon. Nixon assumes that this independent authority will naturally clear him and give him the go-ahead, right? And that's not actually what happens, because Archibald Cox apparently gets word that Nixon has set up tape recorders and wiretaps all over the White House. And Cox is like, well, why don't I subpoena those tapes? Because we can find out pretty quick what the president knows or doesn't know, and that should be all. That should be pretty straightforward, right? We can clear this up pretty quickly. And Cox goes to get a subpoena to acquire those tapes, and Nixon says no. Now, Nixon refuses based upon this concept called executive privilege. Basically, the idea being that if the president has to divulge information relating to his conduct in office, then that might actually, potentially involve grave national security issues. And so that what happens in the Oval Office should stay in the Oval Office, but Cox could kind of make the point that we're not talking about, something that is conducted in the ordinary course of, discharging your duties as president. The president of the United States is supposed to enforce the law, be commander-in-chief of the military, be head of state. Let me go down the list. Does any of those responsibilities include breaking into the Watergate office complex? No. So, yeah, give over the tapes. It's not that hard. And Cox, you also get the feeling that Cox is kind of thinking that it would kind of help resolve the issue pretty quickly. Well, Nixon at this point starts to freak out. This independent prosecutor becomes a little bit too independent for his blood. So he tells his attorney general, Elliot Richardson, to fire Archibald Cox. And Richardson refuses. And so rather than being forced to do it, Richardson resigns. Okay, so then Richardson is actually replaced by the deputy attorney general, who also refuses. And then finally, there is an attorney working for the Justice Department by the name of Robert Bork, who eventually becomes a Supreme Court nominee in the 1980s, admittedly an unsuccessful one, who finally complies with Nixon's request to fire Cox. And so Nixon is actually fired. But here's where things get even more difficult for Nixon. It's at this point that the House of Representatives, which is controlled by the Republican Party, also subpoenas the tapes. Now, Nixon at first refuses, based upon the same arguments he made to Cox, that he shouldn't have to do it because of executive privilege, one, and two, it contains sensitive information about national security. But Congress can't really be fired by Richard Nixon. And so this legal dispute escalates and goes all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. By the way, anytime you see this, United States versus Nixon, that's not a good sign. And that's the name of the court case on whether or not presidential privilege should have to, or covers these tapes recorded at the White House. By the way, all of these tapes, but just so you know, were made by Richard Nixon. It's not like they were created or made or by any of his opponents. So the Supreme Court decides 8-0, with one justice recusing himself, that the tapes were not covered by executive privilege. And so at this point, Nixon is forced to comply with the Supreme Court, and the tapes are turned over to Congress. Now, what the American people hear in these televised congressional investigations is a very different side to Richard Nixon. This is not the Richard Nixon that Americans heard giving stump speeches. This is Richard Nixon in his more unguarded moments, speaking bluntly to staff members and using racial slurs and derogatory language, and also a Nixon that seemed cranky and very, very paranoid. And by the way, if you listen to Lyndon Johnson's tapes, you hear a similar side to him as well. But the thing is that Americans have never heard that before. The presidency has always kind of been cloaked, at least since the advent of radio and TV, with a kind of majestic air. And what Americans kind of learn is that the president poops too, that the president is kind of a normal person like everybody. And the thing is that we don't want presidents to be normal, I think, at least most of the time. And Nixon seemed bumbling. He seemed, it just, Americans have never seen that side to the presidency before. So that's point one. And by the way, Americans also heard Nixon swear profusely and drop a few F-bombs. And I know that doesn't seem like a big deal today, but it kind of was back then. But the other side of Nixon that people saw, or actually an unanswered question about the Nixon tapes, wasn't based upon what was on them, but what wasn't. Because on one tape, recorded just 3 days after the Watergate break-in, there was approximately 18 and a half minutes of silence. Now, one of Nixon's secretaries apparently claims to have been responsible for all or maybe part of that gap, but there's an 18 and a half minute gap. And it's hard to know what took place there. Some people in the Nixon administration, most notably his secretary of, I think it's his defense secretary, Alexander Haig, suggests that what happened with Nixon is that he was spectacularly inept at technology and accidentally recorded over everything. You can believe that or not, but either way, it didn't look good. And not only did it not look good to Democrats, it didn't look good to Republicans. And so here's the other bizarre turn in the Watergate scandal. So a Republican-controlled Congress goes up to a Republican-controlled White House in the aftermath of one of the most one-sided victories in American political history, the election of 1972. And leading Republicans tell Nixon that we can do this the easy way or we can do this the hard way. Basically, what they are suggesting is that Nixon can resign. And if he resigns, that will be the end of it. And there's also some tacit suggestion that that Nixon will be granted a pardon if he allows the country to heal and go sort of quietly into the night. On the other hand, if Nixon tries to obstruct Congress, the argument that Republicans make is that, Mr. President, we're going to pass articles of impeachment in the House, and we have the votes in the House and the Senate to convict. So again, we can do this the hard way or the easy way. Nixon, being the canny politician that he was and ever the realist, decides to do things the easy way. On August 7th, 1974, Richard Nixon becomes the first and so far only president in U.S. history to resign. His vice president, Gerald Ford, becomes president of the United States. And that's in 1974. There's an upcoming election in 1976. So Ford is really remembered for two things.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Three, technically. One being the president in the room when the Helsinki Agreement is signed. That's not even the most important thing. But the other two things is pardoning Richard Nixon, which is very, very controversial. But it's hard to know just how much of that is Ford's responsibility and how much isn't. It has been suggested that one of the reasons that Nixon leaves quietly, without that much of a fuss, is because of a compromise brokered where Nixon will resign the presidency and in exchange not face criminal charges, and the country will just move on. But of course that raises the question of whether or not, maybe the country needed to investigate that fully. Again, those were all sort of the arguments that were raised during the Watergate era. And we also have to remember that as the Vietnam War is de-escalating, we have yet again another example of a pushback against presidential power. Presidential power that if you think about the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, where basically the president gets to do whatever they want to safeguard American troops in Vietnam, that is something that's going to create some pushback, and the fact that, whether it involved Nixon or not, the country or Congress was lied to in the build up to the Vietnam War. So other than that, though, and this is just kind of like a random point, Ford tries to fight inflation through raising interest rates with his WIN program. By the way, it doesn't work. And so that being said, Nixon resigns. And remember that the Nixon administration promised South Vietnam something. They promised South Vietnam that in the event that North Vietnam ever came back, that the United States would respond with sudden, immediate, and overwhelming force. On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnam does come back. And in fact, not only do they invade South Vietnam, but they actually manage to capture Saigon. Now, at this point, Gerald Ford brings up the fact to Congress that the U.S. has made certain security guarantees to South Vietnam. But at this point, Congress has had enough. And so because of its disgust with Watergate and its suspicion of the Nixon administration and these wars that involve deception not only to the American people but to Congress, Congress basically allows for South Vietnam to get rolled up into North Vietnam. And that is the conclusion of the Vietnam War. Arguably a war that is lost at Watergate as much as it's lost in the capture of Saigon. So let's just kind of take a step back and think about the full impact of the Vietnam War. So once again, just like all the big wars in American history, we see this pushback against executive power. So we have the War Powers Resolution, which now requires the president to actually notify Congress about the deployment of troops to military action within 48 hours. In other words, it requires Congress to be brought into the loop, not at the back end of conflict, but at the front end. Also, by the way, the fact that American combat troops were seen as being fairly young during the Vietnam War also leads to the passage of the 26th Amendment. Because remember that except for the matters laid out in the 14th Amendment and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, states had discretion as to how they set their voter laws. And so in some states, you had all different kind of age requirements, age minimums for the right to vote. Well, the thing is now that because of the Vietnam War, you've seen kind of an entire generation of Americans who have fought and bled overseas without an official political voice, because many of them haven't had the right to vote. So in 1971, we see a constitutional amendment that's passed in response to the Vietnam War. Again, war has a way of kind of being an agent of constitutional change. And so you see the ratification of the 26th Amendment in 1971. You also see the emergence of the New Left, but in the very near future, you're going to see the emergence of the New Right. So the New Right is composed of Nixon's silent majority. They're more working class Republicans, religious conservatives, and a growing number of fiscal conservatives who want a political party to sort of espouse pro-business and pro-enterprise beliefs and views. And we'll talk more about them with the emergence of the Reagan coalition.
Now jerky bag. I'll stay here and try to learn how to use the yo-yo. You'll go up and be president, bro.